So we've hit this new wave, the compute power is coming, NVIDIA's like rolling in it. What was it, 2019 or something that ChatGPT sort of 3 came out or something, or 2 or whatever. Like, can you run us through like the next wave? Because now it's becoming sort of accessible to the consumer. So when did that start and who started it?
GPT-2 is when I started to hear about AI being like worth looking into. I was leaving my agency in 2020, and you know, that year got access to Copy AI. Was the first kind of experience I had with GPT-3. They had been building it on GPT-2, which could barely string some sentences together. It was open source. GPT-3 was the first one that was closed source, that OpenAI was like, oh, we've got something here, and they started to sell API access. I think so. Those guys got API access really quickly. I got access to that, and I was like, I remember I was on holiday, and my wife works in journalism, and I was showing her, and she was like, her reaction was not like, wow, this is cool. She was like, oh, this is terrifying. It's like, I can kind of see, what am I going to do in 5 years, if this keeps getting better?
Because this comes up a lot, like what is an LLM? And there's different sort of, there's open source ones now that are a bit like smaller models. And then for the bigger ones, you've got to pay money because they cost more or something. Can you explain the difference there? Because there's lots of models going around. What's the difference between these different ones?
Yeah, so because we're on this curve, the models basically get like twice as good and half the cost. Every 6 months, right? So the models that are coming out today that are small enough to run on your phone, like the new one that Apple announced, they are already better than the best possible model was 2 years ago. So things that were like state of the art 2 years ago, essentially you can assume that like it'll be small enough and cheap enough to run on your phone a few years later. So that's kind of the curve that we're on. So GPT-3, I remember I used a lot, and started to automate a lot of my work. And then when GPT 3.5 came out, which was basically the same model, but really trained to behave, trained to be a bit more useful as like an assistant rather than just a raw model. Then that was what powered ChatGPT, and then we were off to the races, because that was the first major consumer application where it wasn't just an API that us nerds were playing around with. People who could program. Like suddenly people who could, it was a model that actually did a good job that like regular people could try. So they quickly got to 100 million users very quickly. Yeah.
And I remember prior to that, because us nerds had access, right? Like API access. I remember that's sort of what killed really social media, because suddenly a lot of the tech people or people who had access to the stuff could create like 100 viral Twitter tweets that they could then queue into the system and know they'd be pretty successful, and then you had these sort of these content niches like Topilio and like Tweet Hunter and stuff, aggregating the stuff, and then you could kind of do iterations of it at the push of a button, like basically automate your social media. I remember people using that, and then all these other users going, why are they so popular? Like, how do they, tweet so many successful things in a row? And I'm like, there's some tricks happening in the background, you know what I mean? Like, I remember that happening, and then that really killed social media algorithms, and they really had to put the quality filter parameters really high, which has killed all the organic reach, right? But I remember like them having to counteract that force because it was just so good, and there was like this separation between the two people. Okay, so ChatGPT comes out, and then it becomes consumer facing. Everyone's like, oh my god, this is so good, I can kind of do anything.